verses 1 through 8. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up." When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses," and he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said further, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, "I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them."
The gospel reading today comes from Matthew chapter 2. Now after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. So today, since obviously it's kind of a relaxed end of the year kind of day, just kind of chill out, eat some ozoni, have some fun, I want to do a discussion today instead of a sermon. So I hope everybody brought their thinking caps. So let me start off by boring you half to death by talking a little about Pythagoras. So Pythagoras we think of as this mathematician from the 6th century BC. And indeed he was, but he was more than that, a religious leader. He believed in what was called transmutation of the soul, which was a big idea in the Greek world. Plato adhered to that, and it did have a great effect on Christianity as it moved through Greece and Europe. But he had this idea that there was a deeper knowledge to everything, that everything had its root in the supernatural and that which our souls were also rooted in. But he said there were explanations to be found to somehow make them somewhat rational, and that it could be done through mathematics. But some of these secrets were not to be divulged. These were the secrets of the gods, so to speak, and they were to be kept to themselves for those who it had been revealed to. So one example was, we all have heard of the Pythagorean Theorem, this idea that you've got a triangle with straight sides, that the third diagonal, the diagonal side, will be equal to the sum of the squares, okay, of the straights. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Okay, are you bored to death yet? Good. Because it just gets better. All right, so they believed that all numbers were rational, okay, and that in this theorem, these numbers could be explained as ratios to one another. Until they tried to take the square root of the number 2. For some reason, the square root of the number 2 they couldn't express as rational numbers that could be broken down into ratios that were integers. Okay, that being whole numbers, whether they're positive or negative. And so they realized that there was such a thing as irrational numbers. But don't tell anybody. This is from the wisdom of the gods. Well, a man named Hippasus revealed that in some of his writings, and he said that there were some numbers that were just irrational and that just could not be explained in neat little ratios. And he was on a boat shortly thereafter, and it sank and he drowned. And everybody believed that the gods had punished him for revealing this knowledge to the world. See, back in those days, the spiritual and the material were inextricably connected. They were one and the same. If we look at Celtic Christianity, for example, we find the Celts, people who were in Ireland, who were very, very spiritual. Every hill and mountain and river and everything was supposed to contain the Spirit. But when the Romans showed up in the 4th century with Catholicism, they're like, no, we're going to have to do something about this. Didn't work out so well for them, and they ended up with a version of Christianity that was very, very deeply spiritual, that didn't try to disconnect God from the mundane, the sacred from the ordinary. And so, eventually, as we go on over time, we come to the era of Enlightenment. There were a couple of periods of time from the early 1700s that were called the Great Awakenings, when religious fervor came back to life, and they had all these revivals, and people were trying to find ultimate truth. They were trying to find what is true about our existence in this world. And they couldn't quite make sense of things, and eventually started to give up. And this is where the Enlightenment comes in. The Enlightenment said, if it can't be explained rationally, then it isn't. The supernatural is hocus pocus, and we need to divorce the two from each other. If you want to believe in the supernatural, that's your business, but that's way over here. The rational is over here, and it all has an explanation. And so that's why we see, especially in the 1820s and 1830s, all of these state universities that are popping up, because they wanted to separate the religion from the secular. Well, here we are today, and I think we're still, although we're in the post-Enlightenment era, if you want to call it that, of postmodernism, in terms of thought, we're still living in this world where there's a great dichotomy between the spiritual and the ordinary, right? There's the God things, and then there's the ordinary, explicable things. I'm wondering, what if we didn't make God to be this divine clockmaker? Okay? One result of the Enlightenment period was deism, which said God was basically this big guy in the sky who created the world like a clock, who continuously operates and then stepped away. And every once in a while might kind of reach in and affect something through some sort of a miracle, but for the most part is removed from creation and has nothing to do with us anymore. This is deism. What would life be like if we were more like the Celts, or more like the people, not necessarily the Pythagoreans, that's going a little too far to kill each other for revealing divine wisdom and knowledge and all this stuff. But what if we were to see the world as having God still in creation, still working in creation, and still being a part of us? So think about that for a minute. And while you do that, I want to go back to these passages. Exodus. Here's Moses wandering around, and all of a sudden this bush goes up in flames. No explanation. Goes up in the flames, and it doesn't consume the bush. This is irrational. This makes no sense. Things don't happen this way. But it happened anyway. And this voice came out of the fire, saying, Moses, I've got work for you to do. And Moses is like, okay, I should not have eaten that last burrito before I went to bed. And he says, who are you? And God says, I am. He's like, what the heck are you talking about? I'm asking you a question. Can you please give me an answer? I did answer you. I said, I am. I know you are, but who are you? It's like you got who's on first, what's on second, going back and forth between Moses and God. But God says, take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. Moses was experiencing a theophany, a manifestation of the presence of God amidst the ordinary. That, I think, to most of us is comforting in some way. Perhaps we can't quite get our minds wrapped around it and can't quite make sense of it, so it's kind of like, yeah, this stuff doesn't happen. Okay. But it doesn't really totally make us uncomfortable. But if we read this Matthew passage carefully, it should make us very uncomfortable. Because we have a story about a man named Herod who goes and kills every 2-year-old and below child in the kingdom so that he can make sure that they find this kid Jesus and wipe him out. And that it's all by divine mandate. Because it says, first paragraph, this was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I have called my son. Second paragraph, then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet of Jeremiah, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be consoled because her children are no more. Third paragraph, so that what has been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled, he will be called a Nazarene. So basically we're saying we've got all this really yucky stuff, and it's all God's fault. Because the prophets spoke through the power and the voice of God that this stuff would happen, and so it had to come to pass. And it's all God's fault. That troubles me. And I think it should trouble all of us. But as we read this, I think we should realize, again, scriptures are written for a specific reason, in a specific time, specific place, to a specific people for a specific reason. Okay? It wasn't necessarily saying that God was doing these things and God was responsible for them. Because how can we say that we have divorced God from creation and put God up there somewhere who has very little to do with us, but it is yet God's fault that this happened because it says so right here? Okay. So back to my question. What would life be like for us? How would things be different? How might we experience God differently if we didn't have the mindset that God was out there and we're down here and we're just kind of muddling through life and struggling along while God does whatever God does up there? No, I really have to shut up. Yeah.
It used to be such a me versus them attitude. But if everybody really believed that God was here, present in each of us, it wouldn't be an act of me versus them, but us.
Yeah. You're right. Yeah, there would be. Especially if we had the idea that we all had God within us, and how can I be against you when you and I are really connected in a big way? Yeah. Absolutely. And we probably wouldn't argue over whose God is the right God if we all contain God in some way. How else? You don't have to answer the question directly. You can play with it.
There would be a lot less progress.
A lot less progress?
People would be waiting for things to happen for them.
So you think if we thought that God was still in creation, people would do less?
Well, there would be less advanced.
Okay. And that's interesting that you say that, because I had always thought of it the other way. In that if God is out there and we're praying to God to do stuff for us, then we're sitting on our hands doing nothing. But if we believe that we're empowered with God to do things, then we'll actually do them. But I see where you're coming from. It's
I would see it, I see it,
okay.
I would see it that we would wait for God to do something for us.
Oh, no. Okay. Yeah, I guess we would have to say that God is working in us. Active, has something active happening. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
When you asked that question, I thought about, like to Nancy's point, is God inside us, or is he just kind of hanging out, walking around? And think about it, he or she is hanging out, walking around, like I would probably not believe. And I would like think it was a goofy guy on a street corner, and that wouldn't feel great.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I like Nancy's version better.
Right, there wouldn't be a great sense of relatedness with there to that God.
No.
Yeah.
I think that in reflecting on your question about how do we feel and how do I feel, I think that for me, if there was no presence of a deity or God, it would be less in terms of fellowship or less trust. And I think as we do things, we do the best we can do. And after that, we do all humanly things that we can, and after that, it's trusting in God. And I think without that, we'd be more shallow, we'd be more empty, we'd be more difficult, or lonely.
Mhm.
Lonely is a key word too. And I look at the big picture.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, definitely. If God is out there unrelated, it is a lonely existence, right? Yeah. You know, we're in this season of God with us, Emmanuel, right? And it's okay, you know, we think about the baby in the manger and all that, and this is Emmanuel, this is God with us, this is baby Jesus, and that's fine. That's what it's about. However, I think Jesus came to show us something very profound, and I think we missed the point. I think we left it with Jesus and kind of walked away from it. Like, okay, you are God, that's cool, please do something for us. Kind of like what you're saying, you know, but on the flip side, right? Please do something for us. And then Jesus dies on the cross and resurrected, says I'm coming back again. We're still waiting. But if this thing about God with us means that God was with us, but God is with us, and Jesus was a reminder, and every year we celebrate the fact that God is with us, to remind us that God is with us, because we easily forget that. Wouldn't that kind of put a different tint to the season? To me, it would make it more genuine. You know, if we're celebrating just the birth of baby Jesus, who, last time I checked, you know, hit the road 2,000 years ago. Okay, it's exciting. I mean, we all adhere to Christianity, and it still gets us going, but if it was something that is still working, still happening, if it's not merely history or past, but it's still something in the present tense that we are celebrating continuously because it's still happening, then I think that would give us a little more spirit, a little more reassurance, a little less loneliness, to be reminded that God is still with us. What do you think about that? Am I out of my mind? Yeah. Go ahead, Jackie.
Okay, I'll see it first, because John will probably say something really profound. But
That's why I said you should go first.
you know, what I was thinking was that so often we use phrases without thinking of it, like when the bazaar happens and is a success, or yesterday's Mochitsuki is a success. You go, oh, that's by thank God. Or when you're in trouble, you're like, the first thing you pray to is, oh, dear God, help me out of this jam. Or, oh, this happened by the grace of God. And I think sometimes, if you really take those words to heart, I mean, everybody says them all the time, you are reassured that God is still here with us. There are so many things unexplainable that do happen. We haven't just been lucky all these times to get out of these jams, or it isn't by coincidence, it's like a God incident, right? Or Christ incident, whatever you say. But I often feel that way in this place with all of you folks, that the Spirit is moving here, whether we acknowledge it or not, but it does feel so much better when you do acknowledge. That's me. What were you going to say, John?
I was going to pick up on what you were talking about a moment ago, mentioning Spirit, and this is germane to the book study in terms of the Spirit person. And my 2 cents is that a lot of the report writes that Jesus was a Spirit person, and there have been other Spirit people in the world, and I think you touched on it yourself in the sermon, or how many, in the last several weeks, about how all of us have that within us. And I think not to the extent that Nelson Mandela did, or Martin Luther King did, or experience God,
Mhm.
that feeling, what I think of as God, or experiencing God in a way that otherwise I wouldn't. Like Jackie's saying, experiencing and feeling it here
Yeah.
on a Sunday, in a way that I'm not going to Monday when I go back to work.
Mhm. Which we would hope that we can make spirituality, not necessarily religion in the sense of dogmas and tenets and things like that, but presence of God carried with us out when we do go to work on Monday, and not just here, right? And in the things, whether it's Akiman City or whether it's other events that we have, that we can say, that's a God thing. But I don't mean that God, way out there, just for some crazy reason, decided to say, you know, I'm going to affect some change here to that. But that God was somehow working in it all from the beginning, all the way from back in creation, that God is still working toward the good of creation in this continuous flow of creation. Right? I'll go to Weston's football games, and the parents will be like, did you throw up a prayer for us? And I'm like, no. I'm like, what? I'm like, well, I prayed that nobody would get hurt, but you think there's nobody on the other side praying that their team's going to win? One of us is going to be calling God a liar in about 37 minutes. So, right? It's not how it works. At least not in my book. You know? Yeah, we've kind of made God as this inconsequential talisman type thing, you know, just kind of like rub the belly of the Buddha or whatever and hope for good luck type thing, you know. And when it doesn't happen, well, better luck next time. But if we could see God differently, working, being, not just working in, but being a part of the very fabric of creation, a very part of our own existence and all the way to the depths of our soul, that, I think, would make us experience God so much more deeply and make not just this church thing that we do on Sunday, but life in general so much more meaningful, so much more profound, so much more like Moses standing in front of a burning bush. But the difference is, we'd be able to see that burning bush where we hadn't been able to before. Does anyone add anything else in closing? Well, you know somebody that's gonna, you're just itching to say something. What about you, Michelle? Not really? Okay. Well, this is fun. Thank you. Although I did do a lot of yammering as usual, at least it's nice to have discussions and to do these things. And to remember, too, this doesn't take away from the person of Jesus. This doesn't take away saying that, okay, well, if we're all inhabited by God, then Jesus was inconsequential. That's not what we're saying. Jesus is just as profound as he was before we started talking about this. Jesus is the one who taught us what's going on and opened our eyes to be able to see it. But it's always been up to us whether we actually do see it or not. Okay. All right. Would you please stand with me and sing, Here I Am, Lord?